This reconstruction of a Mediterranean cog was designed by Xavier Pastor, who was a well-known Portuguese marine historian, about 40 years ago. It's based on the illustration on a manuscript cover dated 1343. In the late Middle Ages, cogs were the ubiquitous maids of all work. The only real distinction between North European and Mediterranean cogs is that the former were clinker-built and the latter were carvel-built. A few cog wrecks have been found, especially the Bremen cog, from which quite a bit of detail can be learnt. My model follows Pastor's reconstruction exactly. It's worth mentioning that this is an idealised representation. The real vessels would have been pretty crudely built. Probably even the deck planks would have been loosely fitted rather than fixed. This model was built a good few years ago, and I've talked about it on several occasions. Tonight, rather than yet another blow-by-blow account, and in the spirit of On the Stocks, I want to illustrate just a few tips and techniques that I've found to be generally useful. The starting point, of course, is a lines plan, which is normally sufficient in itself. But if you have the facilities, and I confess I don't think nowadays I could still do it, you can put together a 3D computer model, which can be helpful in designing interior structure, deck beams, etc. As you may know, I'm a great advocate of the Harold Hahn method of model building, wherein the frames are mounted upside down on the building board, which becomes a reference plane. The building board is simply a rigid flat board on which can be glued a printout of an extension of the top timbers of each frame, and the location of those timbers can then cut out later. It is worth taking some trouble with this board, however. Make sure that the sides are straight and accurately parallel, and the centre line is genuinely in the centre. It helps also to mount upright boards on the ends to which can be attached printouts of the body plan. And finally, stretch a piece of black cotton between razor saw slots on the centre lines of each board. Don't fix the cotton. It will inevitably catch on everything that you do, and it'll get dragged out frequently, so you need an easy way of reinstating it. I'll come back to that in a minute. This is, in fact, the fully framed cog hull. You can see now the reason for accuracy in setting up the building board. Using a marking gauge or a simple equivalent device running along the edge of the board, you can set it to any point on a frame and then switch to the other side and check the symmetry. Alternatively, you can pick up a point from the body plan on the end plate and check that the relevant point matches. Coming back now to the piece of cotton, by looking down and aligning the cotton with the centre line on the end plate, you can see immediately if a frame, and in this case the loosely fitted keel, is accurately centred. Here obviously it's not. It's now very easy to realign the errant frame before gluing it to the baseboard. Moving on, here is the planked hull, still fitted to the building board. At an earlier stage I will also have fitted a couple of captive nuts in the keelson, eventually to take the pillars of the display stand. Meanwhile, they are used to fix the hull to a building cradle in preparation for work on the interior. One of the characteristics of cogs is that some beam ends were left protruding, and Pastor thought it likely that these also incorporated the scuppers by way of an oblique drain hole like this. This now shows the interior of the hull, still fixed to the building board, upside down to allow work inside. I should say that I always leave the hull fixed as long as possible to the building board, and certainly until the deck beams are in, to maintain the shape of the hull. Here you can see some of the dummy deck beams carrying the drilled outboard ends prior to fitting them to the actual deck beams. I'll digress here just to stress that you can rarely have too many clamps in model building, but they're often very simple to make. Here are a couple of types that I use a lot. One type are simply slices of aluminium or steel channel with an M4 machine screw fitted. The other, shown here, is an adapted clothes peg with a T-shaped and flat jaw, used for planking. The T-arm fits between the frames while the flat jaw holds the plank in place. Finally, though at a much later stage, here is the effect of the protruding beam ends. I have to say that with hindsight I think these are too long, and it's more likely they were about half that length. The next point that I want to illustrate is the benefit of building the model as a kit. Never fix anything until you can't avoid it any longer. This avoids damage to your already built hull, and more helpfully, it allows the use of jigs, etc. to get the alignments right. What you see here is the bare hull with a couple of loose fittings, plus the basic framework for the forecastle, which will be used off the hull to assemble the unit. In this case it's very simple, basically an assembly of diagonal gratings and a rail, the gratings being made on the usual egg box principle. The stern castle is a different matter. It has a curved taper along the line of the hull, a tumble home, a deck camber, and a slight shear. The first step was to shape a piece of plywood to conform to the aft section of the hull, the piece of plywood being located using loose bamboo pegs to assist alignment and refitting of the eventual structure. The various parts can then be assembled to match the required shapes of the two decks of the castle. Only when entirely complete would they be refitted to the hull. The result of all this is seen here. Note the light spots that mark the positions of the locating dowels. Let me turn now to a couple of details that might be of interest. On the evidence of the Bremen cog, the lavatory of the cog was located aft, in contrast to the heads of later practice. Accordingly, I fitted a couple of toilet chutes over the aft quarters. Note also in this picture some of the holes for the dowels that will be used to locate the stern castle. According to Pastor, the anchor for these cogs was a four-armed grapnel called a resel, and I had some trouble deciding how to replicate this. Now, the easy part is to bend the arms and to silver solder the flukes to the four shaped arms. The problem was how to hold these arms and the shank in register while the whole lot was soft soldered. Eventually the penny dropped. I could trap each arm lightly between the jaws of a four-jaw chuck and then hold them together with a piece of nichrome wire wrapped around all five elements. It was then easy to apply soft solder and strip away the wire. I should mention this picture is a post hoc staging that will have been cleaned up a bit. Let me now move on to my technique for making ship's boats. The first step is a bread and butter assembly of a plug with each layer painted black. The result is that when the plug is carved to shape, the water lines show up automatically, simplifying the process of checking the accuracy of the shape. Depending on the shape of the boat, it may be desirable to make a multi-part plug held together with dowels, remembering to locate the dowels above the shear line so that they can be removed after the plug has been planked. Removing the dowels then allows the plug to be removed in sections. In this particular case, the plug was split along the keel line and a thin sheet inserted, leaving a shallow groove of the same width as the keel. This allowed the keel to be placed on the plug, which was then planked from keel to shear line. In this case, part of the stem post had to be added later because of its recurved shape. Before planking, I paint the plug with a candle wax dissolved in paraffin. Finally, it's just a matter of adding detail to the model. Here, I've added an elm tree pump, a masthead ladder. You probably saw from the model at the beginning that there was what we would now call a crow's nest, and I've added various bits of deck cargo, and particularly figures. Figures are important to lend a sense of scale to a model. And if, like me, you're not much good as a sculptor, there are a great many good scale plastic figures available now that are comparatively easy to adapt to the scene that you're creating. And finally, this is an experiment to see if it worked, and it did. This is a Chinese made turntable. It cost me all of £8. And as a first shot, I'm quite pleased with the way it's turned out for recording what the model looks like. You can see what I mean about those beam ends. They are just impracticable at that length. Thank you.